Margaret Hayes had worked in grand homes for 30 years, but the Morrison estate still took her breath away each morning. The library alone was larger than the house she'd grown up in. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that caught the morning light, streaming through tall windows. A crystal chandelier hung from the coffered ceiling, casting warm pools of light across the polished oak floors. She was a woman in her early 40s, with kind eyes and strong hands that had scrubbed floors, folded linens, and prepared countless meals. Her gray uniform dress with white collar and cuffs was always pressed and neat. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, practical and dignified. It was during her second week that she first noticed something troubling about young Thomas Morrison. The boy was 11 years old, small for his age, with soft brown hair that fell across his forehead, and thoughtful hazel eyes that seemed to carry a weight no child should bear. He wore the navy blazer and striped tie of Preston Academy, one of the finest schools in the city. But Margaret noticed how he'd slip into the library each afternoon, hovering near the shelves with a longing that broke her heart. One Thursday, she found him sitting in the leather armchair by the window, staring at an open book in his lap. Tears streamed silently down his cheeks. "Thomas," she said softly, setting down her dusting cloth. "Are you all right, dear?" The boy looked up, startled, quickly wiping his face with his sleeve. In that moment of vulnerability, she saw it all. The shame, the fear, the loneliness. "I'm fine," he whispered, but his voice cracked. Margaret moved closer, her instincts as a mother of 3 guiding her. "May I sit with you a moment?" He nodded, unable to speak. She settled into the chair beside him, letting the silence rest between them like a gentle hand. Through the window, she could see the garden stretching toward the river, autumn leaves dancing in the breeze. "Sometimes," Margaret said quietly, "the hardest things to talk about are the ones we need to share most." Thomas's fingers gripped the book tightly. "I can't read," he finally said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Everyone at Preston can read. They've been reading since they were 5. But the letters jump around. They don't make sense. My father thinks I'm not trying hard enough. The teachers say I'm being difficult." Margaret's heart ached. She recognized this struggle. Her own son, Michael, had faced the same challenge years ago. Back then, they hadn't had a name for it. Now they called it dyslexia. "Thomas," she said gently, "have you ever seen a river find its way to the ocean?" He looked at her, confused by the question. "A river doesn't take the straight path," she continued. "It winds and curves, sometimes doubling back on itself. But it always finds its way. Your mind is like that river, dear. It takes a different path, but that doesn't mean you won't get there." "But the other boys," he started. "The other boys aren't you, and that's perfectly fine." Over the following days, Margaret watched Thomas more carefully. She saw how his father, Richard Morrison, a stern man in expensive suits, barely looked at his son during their brief encounters in the hallway. His mother had passed away 3 years earlier. The boy was essentially alone in this big house, despite all its grandeur. The following Monday, Margaret made a decision. After her duties were complete, she found Thomas in the library again. "Would you like some help?" she asked simply. His eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. "You'd help me?" "If you'd like me to. We'll start small, just a little bit each day." And so they began. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, after the house had settled into its quiet rhythm, Margaret and Thomas would meet in the library. She brought colored cards and highlighters, tricks she'd learned with Michael. They started with simple words, breaking them into sounds, building them back together like puzzle pieces. "Cat," Thomas would say slowly, sounding it out. "Cat." "Beautiful," Margaret would smile. "Now let's try another." Progress was slow. Some days, Thomas would grow frustrated, tears threatening to spill. Margaret would pause then, put the books aside, and they'd talk instead. About his mother who used to sing to him. About her own children, grown now with families of their own. About how the measure of a person isn't in how quickly they learn, but in their willingness to keep trying. "My father says I'm a disappointment," Thomas confessed one rainy afternoon, the words heavy with pain. Margaret set down the book they'd been working through. "Your father is wrong," she said firmly but gently. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see courage. Every day you come here, Even when it's hard, that takes real strength. Months passed. Autumn turned to winter, and the library grew cozy with the fire crackling in the hearth. Thomas began to improve. Simple sentences became paragraphs. Picture books gave way to chapter books. The joy on his face, when he finished his first short story, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "I did it!" he exclaimed, his face flushed with pride. "I read the whole thing!" "You certainly did," Margaret beamed. "I knew you would." But they kept their lesson secret. Thomas feared his father's reaction, worried that Richard would see his struggle as even more evidence of failure. Margaret understood, though it pained her to see the boy carry such shame. Spring arrived, and with it, preparations for Preston Academy's annual academic ceremony. Thomas came home one day, his face pale. "They want me to give a speech," he said, panic in his voice. "The headmaster chose me." He said something about second chances and perseverance. "But Margaret, I can't read in front of everyone. They'll know. They'll all know." Margaret took his trembling hands in hers. "Thomas, listen to me. You've read entire books. You've worked harder than anyone I know. You can do this. But what if I mess up?" "Then you mess up," she said simply. "And you keep going. That's what brave people do." They practiced his speech every day for 2 weeks. Margaret helped him mark the difficult words, create mental pictures, develop strategies for when the letters started to swim. She watched him gain confidence, watched him transform from a frightened boy into a young man finding his voice. The night of the ceremony, Margaret wasn't invited. Staff didn't attend such events. But Thomas had pressed a note into her hand that morning. "Please come. I need you there." So Margaret stood quietly at the back of the great auditorium, wearing her best Sunday dress. The room was filled with parents in evening wear, students in their finest uniforms, teachers in academic robes. Crystal chandeliers cast light over hundreds of expectant faces. When Thomas walked to the podium, Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. He looked so small up there, so vulnerable. She saw his hands shake as he unfolded his paper. He began slowly, carefully. His voice wavered at first. But as he read about perseverance, about accepting help, about the kindness of unexpected teachers, it grew stronger. Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks as she listened to him read beautifully, confidently, each word a small miracle. But then, in the middle of a sentence, Thomas stopped. He looked up from his paper, his eyes scanning the audience until they found Margaret at the back of the room. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice clear in the hushed auditorium. "This speech talks about accepting help and perseverance. But I didn't write about the person who taught me what those words really mean." Margaret felt her breath catch. For the past 8 months, Margaret Hayes, who works in our home, has spent every afternoon teaching me to read. I have dyslexia. The letters get confused for me. School was a nightmare. But Margaret never gave up on me, even when I wanted to give up on myself. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret saw Richard Morrison stand up in the front row, his face unreadable. "She didn't have to help me," Thomas continued, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't her job. But she did anyway because that's who she is. She's the kindest, most patient teacher I've ever had. And I want everyone here to know that without her, I wouldn't be standing here at all." The room was absolutely silent. Then slowly one person began to clap. Then another, and another. Soon the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding. Not just for Thomas, but turning to look at Margaret. Acknowledging her, honoring her. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. Through her tears, she saw Richard Morrison walking toward her. She braced herself, unsure what to expect. The man who reached her was different from the stern figure she'd known. His eyes were wet, his expression humble. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "I've been so focused on business, on expectations, on maintaining appearances, that I failed to see my own son's pain. You saw him. You helped him. You gave him what I couldn't." His voice broke. "I don't know how to thank you." "Love him," Margaret said simply. "Just love him as he is." Richard nodded, unable to speak, and reached out to shake her hand. But Margaret, moved by the moment, pulled him into a brief motherly embrace. After the ceremony, as guests lingered over refreshments, the headmaster approached Margaret. "Mrs. Hayes, would you consider working with other students who struggle with reading? We have several who could benefit from your approach." Margaret thought of all the children who might be sitting alone with unopened books, feeling broken and ashamed. "I'd be honored," she said. That night, as Margaret prepared to leave the Morrison estate, Thomas ran up to her. "Thank you," he said, hugging her tightly. "Thank you for seeing me." Margaret held him close, thinking of all the children in the world who just needed someone to believe in them. "Thank you for letting me help," she whispered. "You've taught me just as much, dear." As she walked home through the quiet streets, the spring air sweet with blooming flowers, Margaret thought about how the smallest acts of kindness could change a life, how patience and compassion mattered more than credentials, how everyone, no matter their station in life, had gifts to give. Thomas Morrison would go on to graduate with honors, eventually becoming a teacher himself, specializing in helping children with learning differences. But he never forgot the woman who had seen past his struggles to the person he could become. And Margaret Hayes continued her work, both at the Morrison estate and at Preston Academy, touching countless lives with her simple belief that every child deserved someone who wouldn't give up on them. In the grand library where it all began, a small brass plaque was eventually placed on the wall, in honor of Margaret Hayes, who taught us that the greatest wisdom often comes in the quietest voices, and that real education is born of love. Sometimes the most important lessons aren't found in books at all, but in the hands that hold them open and the hearts willing to light the way.